Some people walk into your life like they never left, turning an ordinary Tuesday into the night that changes everything. David had always been someone who found comfort in routine. Every evening after coming home from his job at the local bookstore, he would make himself a simple dinner, check his messages, and settle into his favorite corner of the room with a book or his old laptop. His apartment wasn't much to look at, just a small space with basic furniture and walls that had seen better days. But it was his sanctuary. Tonight felt no different from any other Tuesday evening. The rain outside was making that gentle tapping sound against his window, and he had just finished eating leftover pizza while scrolling through social media. Nothing particularly exciting was happening in his life, and honestly, he had grown comfortable with that predictability. At 28, David had learned to appreciate the quiet moments between life's bigger events. He was just about to reach for his current book when he heard something that made him pause. Footsteps in the hallway outside his door. This wasn't unusual. Other people lived in the building too. But something about these particular steps seemed deliberate, as if someone was walking specifically toward his apartment. The steps slowed as they approached his door, then stopped completely. David waited, listening carefully. Maybe it was just someone visiting a neighbor. But then he heard a soft knock, so gentle he almost thought he had imagined it. He wasn't expecting anyone. His friends usually called before dropping by, and delivery drivers typically knocked much louder. He set his book aside and walked toward the door, wondering who could be visiting at this hour. When he opened the door, time seemed to stop completely. She was standing there in the hallway, and for a moment, David couldn't quite process what he was seeing. The dim hallway lighting seemed to frame her perfectly, creating an almost magical glow around her figure. She was wearing a simple white sweater and jeans, nothing fancy. But something about the way she stood there made the ordinary hallway look like a scene from a movie. "Hi, David," she said softly, her voice carrying a warmth that immediately filled the empty space around them. It was Jessica, the girl he had known years ago, the one who had moved away for college and somehow never quite made it back into his life, despite all the promises they had made to stay in touch. Yet here she was, standing at his door as if no time had passed at all. "Jessica," he managed to say, his voice coming out more confused than welcoming. "What are you doing here?"
"How did you even find my address?"
She smiled, that same gentle smile he remembered so well. "I was in town visiting family and I asked around. I hope you don't mind me just showing up like this. I wanted to see you." David stepped back almost automatically, gesturing for her to come inside. As she walked past him into his small apartment, he caught a hint of her perfume, something light and floral that reminded him of spring mornings. The scent brought back a flood of memories he had carefully tucked away over the years. "Please sit down," he said, suddenly aware of how messy his place must look to someone who hadn't seen it before. There were books scattered on the coffee table, a coffee mug from this morning still sitting on the kitchen counter, and his work clothes draped over the back of a chair. But Jessica didn't seem to notice or care about any of that. She settled onto his couch, tucking her legs under her in a way that was so familiar it made his heart skip. "This is a nice place," she said, looking around with genuine interest. "It feels very much like you." David wasn't sure if that was a compliment or not, but something in her tone suggested she meant it kindly. He remained standing for a moment, still trying to wrap his mind around the fact that she was actually here, in his living room, after all these years of wondering what had become of her. "Can I get you something to drink?" he asked, falling back on basic hospitality because he couldn't think of anything else to say. "I have water, some juice, maybe some tea." "Water would be perfect," she replied, but her eyes never left his face. There was something in her expression that suggested she was studying him, taking in how he had changed since they last saw each other. As David moved around his small kitchen, getting a glass and filling it with water, he tried to calm his racing thoughts. Why was she here? What did this visit mean? They had lost touch gradually after she moved away for college. Their conversations had become less frequent, their text messages shorter until eventually they had stopped communicating altogether. It wasn't dramatic or painful, just one of those natural drifting aparts that happens when life takes people in different directions. But now she was here, and David found himself remembering all the things he had liked about her. The way she really listened when people talked, how she could make even ordinary conversations feel important. The way she saw good things in people and situations that others might overlook. When he handed her the water, their fingers touched briefly, and David felt a small electric shock run through him. She didn't pull away immediately, letting the contact linger for just a moment longer than necessary. "Thank you," she said, taking a small sip. "You know, I've thought about you a lot over the years. Wondered how you were doing, what your life was like now." David sat down in the chair across from her, maintaining some distance because he wasn't sure he could trust himself to sit too close. "Really, I thought about you too sometimes, especially when I'd pass by places we used to go together." The conversation felt surreal. Here they were, talking as if they were picking up from where they had left off years ago. Yet David was acutely aware of all the time that had passed, all the experiences they hadn't shared, all the ways they had both probably changed. Jessica set her glass down on the coffee table and looked directly at him. "I know this is probably weird, me just showing up like this, but I'm only in town for a couple of days and I couldn't leave without seeing you. There were things I wanted to say that I never got the chance to say before." David felt his heart rate increase. "What kind of things?" She was quiet for a moment, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Just important things. Things that have been on my mind for a long time." The rain outside had gotten heavier, creating a steady rhythm against the window that seemed to emphasize the intimacy of the moment. David's small apartment, which had felt so ordinary just 30 minutes ago, now felt charged with possibility. The familiar space seemed different with Jessica in it, as if her presence had transformed everything from mundane to magical. He realized he was staring at her, taking in all the small details of how she looked now compared to his memories. Her hair was a little shorter, her style more mature, but her eyes were exactly the same. Warm and expressive and full of life. She had always had this quality about her that made people feel like they were the only person in the room when she was talking to them. "I'm glad you came," David said finally, meaning it completely. Whatever had brought her here tonight, whatever she wanted to talk about, he was grateful for this unexpected gift of her presence in his life again, even if it was only temporary. David found himself studying Jessica's face, looking for all the familiar features he remembered from years before. She had changed, but in subtle ways that somehow made her even more beautiful than his memories had painted her. There were tiny lines around her eyes when she smiled, evidence of laughter and experiences he hadn't been part of. Her confidence seemed more natural now, less like the careful confidence of a young person trying to figure out their place in the world. "Do you remember the first time we met?" Jessica asked, settling back into the couch cushions. "At that coffee shop near campus?" How could he forget? David had been sitting alone reading a book about photography when she had approached his table. She had been looking for somewhere to sit because the place was packed, and she had asked if she could share his table. What should have been a simple, practical arrangement had turned into a 3-hour conversation that covered everything, from their favorite movies to their biggest fears about the future. "You were reading that book about street photography," she continued, "and you looked so serious and focused. I almost didn't want to interrupt you, but there really wasn't anywhere else to sit." "I'm glad you did interrupt me," David said, and meant it. "That book wasn't nearly as interesting as talking to you turned out to be." Jessica laughed, and the sound filled his small apartment in a way that made it feel bigger somehow. "You were so nervous when I first sat down. You kept adjusting your bookmark and reorganizing the things on the table." David felt his cheeks warm slightly. "I wasn't used to beautiful women just sitting down at my table and starting conversations." "Is that what I did?" she asked, raising an eyebrow playfully. "I thought I was just being practical about seating arrangements." They both knew that wasn't entirely true. Even from that first meeting, there had been something magnetic between them, something that had made a simple shared table turn into the beginning of a relationship that had shaped both of their lives, in ways they were probably still discovering. "You ordered that weird tea blend," David remembered, "something with cardamom and rose petals. I had never heard of anyone drinking tea like that before." "My grandmother's recipe," Jessica said softly. "She taught me that tea should be an experience, not just something to wake you up in the morning." David remembered how fascinated he had been by little details like that. Jessica had grown up in a family that valued traditions and took time to appreciate small pleasures. Her grandmother had taught her to make that special tea. Her mother had shown her how to tend a garden. Her father had introduced her to classic films from decades before she was born. Coming from a family where practical concerns always took priority over sentimental ones, David had been amazed by how much meaning Jessica found in everyday moments. "Your grandmother," David said, "is she still—" "She passed away 2 years ago," Jessica replied, her voice gentle but sad. "It was peaceful, though. She was 94 and had been telling us for months that she was ready to go. Even at the end, she was more worried about making sure everyone else was okay than about herself." David felt a pang of sadness for the loss of someone he had never met, but had heard Jessica talk about so fondly. "I'm sorry. I know how much she meant to you." "She did," Jessica nodded. "Actually, that's part of why I'm here tonight. Going through her things after she died, I found some old letters I had written to her while I was in college. Letters where I talked about you, about us, about how confused I was when everything fell apart between us." The mention of how their relationship had ended brought a more serious tone to the conversation. David had tried not to think too much about those last few months they had been together, when everything had started feeling strained and difficult. Jessica had been accepted to a graduate program across the country, and David had been dealing with his father's illness and the family business that needed his attention. They had tried to make it work long distance for a while, but between her new life and his complicated family situation, something had been lost. "I never handled that well," David admitted. "The whole long-distance thing, I mean. I wasn't good at staying connected when you weren't physically there. And with everything happening with my dad, I was pretty much a mess." "How is your father now?" Jessica asked, leaning forward with genuine concern. "He's doing much better, actually. It took a couple of years, but he recovered completely. The business is stable now, too. I think I was so afraid of everything falling apart that I didn't handle any of it very well, including us." Jessica was quiet for a moment, seeming to process this information. "I always wondered if I should have stayed or at least tried harder to make the distance work. But I was 22 and terrified that if I didn't take that opportunity, I'd regret it for the rest of my life." "You made the right choice," David said, and realized he meant it. "You were always meant for bigger things than this small town could offer." "Maybe," she said, "but I've learned that bigger isn't always better. Different isn't always better either." David wanted to ask what she meant by that, but he sensed there was more she wanted to share in her own time. Instead, he found himself remembering all the small moments from their relationship that he had treasured. The way she would curl up next to him when they watched movies, stealing his popcorn and making commentary about the characters. How she would drag him to art museums and spend 20 minutes studying a single painting, pointing out details he never would have noticed on his own. The conversations they used to have about their dreams and plans for the future. Conversations that felt so important and significant at the time. "Do you remember that trip we took to the lake?" Jessica asked, as if she had been following a similar train of thought. "It was right before I graduated, and we spent the whole weekend just walking around and talking about what came next." David remembered it perfectly. They had stayed in a tiny cabin that belonged to Jessica's family, spending their days hiking and their evenings sitting on the dock, watching the sun set over the water. It had been one of those perfect weekends that felt like it existed outside of regular time, where nothing mattered except being together and enjoying each other's company. "That was the weekend you told me about the graduate program," David said. "When it first became real that you were leaving, I was so scared to tell you," Jessica admitted. "I knew it would change everything between us, and I didn't want it to. I wanted to somehow have both things, the new opportunity and what we had together. Life doesn't usually work that way, though," David said gently. "No," Jessica agreed. "It doesn't, but sometimes if you're really lucky, it gives you second chances to figure out what really matters." The rain outside had grown stronger, and David could hear it drumming against his windows with increasing intensity. It created a sense of being sealed off from the rest of the world, as if his small apartment had become a private bubble where only he and Jessica existed. The sound was oddly comforting, like nature itself was giving them permission to take all the time they needed for this conversation. Jessica had grown quieter, and David could see she was gathering her thoughts for something important. She was turning her water glass slowly in her hands, watching the condensation form little droplets that caught the lamplight. It was a gesture he remembered from years before, something she did when she was trying to find the right words for difficult topics. "David," she said finally, looking up to meet his eyes, "I need to tell you something that I should have said years ago." The seriousness in her voice made David's heart rate pick up. He had been enjoying the gentle nostalgia of their conversation, but now he sensed they were moving into deeper waters. "Okay," he said simply, giving her space to continue. "When I left for graduate school, I told you it was because I needed to follow my dreams and explore new opportunities. And that was true, but it wasn't the whole truth." Jessica set down her glass and folded her hands in her lap. "The real reason I left was because I was terrified of how much I cared about you." David felt like the air had been knocked out of his lungs. "What do you mean?" "I mean that what we had together was unlike anything I had ever experienced before. You made me feel completely understood and accepted in a way that was both wonderful and scary. I was 22 and had never felt that connected to another person. Part of me worried that if I stayed, I would lose myself completely in loving you." David stared at her, trying to process what she was saying. "So you left because you cared too much?" "I left because I was young and stupid, and thought that independence meant not needing anyone else," Jessica said with a sad smile. "I convinced myself that relying on you, or wanting to build a life with you, somehow made me weak or less of a person." The honesty in her words was like a key turning in a lock David hadn't even realized was there. All these years he had assumed that Jessica had left because he wasn't enough for her, because her dreams were bigger than anything he could offer. Learning that she had left because she was overwhelmed by her feelings for him changed everything about how he understood their past. "I wish you had told me that then," David said softly. "I spent years thinking I had somehow failed you, that I wasn't interesting enough or ambitious enough to keep up with your plans." "You never failed me," Jessica said firmly. "If anything, I failed you by not being brave enough to trust what we had together. I was so afraid of losing my independence that I threw away the best thing in my life." David got up from his chair and moved to the couch, sitting down next to Jessica, but leaving some space between them. Being closer felt important for this conversation, but he wasn't sure yet what it all meant or where it was leading. "What happened after you left?" he asked. "Did you find what you were looking for?" Jessica laughed, but there wasn't much humor in it. "I found a lot of things. I got my degree. I traveled. I had a successful career for a while. I even got engaged to someone a few years ago." David felt a sharp pang of something that might have been jealousy. "What happened with that?" "I realized I was trying to recreate something that I had already had with you, but it wasn't working. He was a good person, but he wasn't you. And more importantly, I wasn't the same person with him that I had been with you. I was holding back parts of myself, being careful not to care too much, not to need too much. It wasn't fair to him, and it wasn't fair to me. So you broke up." "We did. It was amicable, but it was also a wake-up call. I realized I had been running from the wrong thing all along. I thought I was protecting my independence, but really I was protecting myself from vulnerability. And in doing that, I was missing out on the kind of deep connection that actually makes life meaningful." David absorbed this information, feeling a mix of sadness for the pain Jessica had experienced and hope for what her revelations might mean for them now. "Is that why you're here tonight?" "Partly," Jessica said. "When my grandmother died and I found those old letters, I realized how much time I had wasted being afraid. Life is shorter than we think it is, and the people who really matter to us are rarer than we want to admit." She turned to face him more directly, and David could see tears forming in her eyes. "I know I have no right to walk back into your life after all this time and expect anything. You've probably moved on. Maybe you have someone special now. Maybe you've built a life that doesn't have room for complicated history." "I don't," David said quickly. "Have someone special, I mean. There have been a few relationships over the years, but nothing that lasted. Nothing that felt like—" He paused, not sure how to finish that sentence. "Nothing that felt like what we had?" Jessica asked gently. "Exactly," David admitted. "I tried to convince myself that what we had was just young love, that it seemed more significant than it actually was because we were both inexperienced. But every relationship I've had since then has felt like something was missing." Jessica reached over and took his hand, and David felt that same electric connection he had experienced earlier when she touched him while taking the water glass. Her skin was warm and soft, and her touch felt like coming home. "I know this is a lot to dump on you all at once," she said, "and I know it's not fair of me to show up after all these years and complicate your life. But I had to tell you how I felt, what I learned about myself and what you meant to me. Even if nothing comes of it, I needed you to know that losing you wasn't about you not being enough. It was about me being too scared to appreciate what I had." David squeezed her hand gently. What are you hoping will happen now? I don't know, Jessica said honestly. I know I can't just pick up where we left off like nothing happened. We're both different people now, and we've both been through experiences that changed us. But I also know that sitting here with you tonight feels more right than anything has felt in years. The rain outside had settled into a steady, gentle rhythm, and David realized that the dreamlike quality of the evening had shifted into something more real and immediate. This wasn't just a nostalgic visit from his past. It was a potential doorway into a different future than the one he had been imagining for himself. I don't know either, David said, but I'm glad you came. I'm glad you told me all of this. Even if it's scary and uncertain, it's better than wondering for the rest of my life what might have been. The silence that followed their conversation wasn't uncomfortable. Instead, it felt full of possibility, like the pause before something beautiful begins. David could feel the warmth of Jessica's hand in his, and he found himself studying the details of her face in the soft lamplight. She was looking back at him with the same intensity, as if she was trying to memorize this moment. You know what's strange? Jessica said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I've imagined this conversation so many times over the years, but I never imagined it feeling this natural. I thought it would be awkward or painful, but instead it feels like the most honest I've been with anyone in a very long time. David understood exactly what she meant. Despite all the years that had passed, despite all the uncertainty about what came next, sitting here with Jessica felt effortless in a way that surprised him. Maybe that's because we never really stopped knowing each other, he said. Maybe some connections are deeper than time or distance. Jessica smiled, and David noticed how her whole face lit up when she did. You always had a way of saying exactly what I was thinking but couldn't put into words. Did I? David asked, genuinely curious. I always felt like you were the one who was good with words. You were the one who could explain feelings and make sense of complicated emotions. We were good together that way, Jessica said. We balanced each other out. You helped me feel grounded when my thoughts were spinning too fast, and I helped you find words for things you felt but couldn't express. As she spoke, David realized how much he had missed having someone who understood him that way. Over the years, he had gotten used to keeping his deeper thoughts and feelings to himself, partly because he had never found anyone else who seemed genuinely interested in that side of him. His relationships had been pleasant enough, but they had stayed on the surface level. None of his partners had ever seemed curious about his inner world the way Jessica had been. Can I ask you something? Jessica said, shifting slightly on the couch so she was facing him more directly. Of course. What has your life been like? I mean, really like. Not just the basic facts about work and where you live. What brings you joy? What do you worry about? What do you dream about when you let yourself really dream? The questions caught David off guard, not because they were inappropriate, but because it had been so long since anyone had asked him anything that personal. He had to think for a moment about how to answer honestly. I think I've been playing it safe for a long time, he said slowly. After you left and after everything with my dad's illness, I got into a pattern of just focusing on getting through each day. The bookstore is comfortable, my apartment is fine, I have a few close friends. It's a good life, but it's not an adventurous one. Jessica nodded encouragingly, and David found himself wanting to dig deeper, to give her the kind of honest answer she deserved. But lately, especially tonight, I've been realizing that maybe I've been too focused on avoiding disappointment, instead of pursuing things that actually excite me. I used to take pictures all the time, remember? I had all those ideas about traveling and documenting different communities and cultures. You were so talented, Jessica said warmly. Do you still have your camera? David felt slightly embarrassed. It's in my closet somewhere. I haven't used it seriously in probably 3 years. Why not? I guess I convinced myself it was just a hobby, that it wasn't practical to spend time on something that probably wouldn't lead anywhere. As he said the words, David realized how sad they sounded, how much he had diminished his own dreams over the years. Jessica was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. That doesn't sound like the David I knew. The David I knew believed that doing something you loved was never a waste of time, even if it didn't lead to fame or fortune. Maybe I lost that version of myself somewhere along the way, David admitted. Maybe, Jessica said. Or maybe you just buried him under years of being careful and practical. Maybe he's still in there, waiting for the right moment to come back out. The way she said it made David feel hopeful in a way he hadn't experienced in a long time. There was something about Jessica's presence that made him want to be the person he used to be. The person who took risks and followed his curiosity and believed in the value of creating beautiful things. "What about you?" David asked. "What brings you joy now?" Jessica considered the question carefully. "I've learned to appreciate small moments more than I used to. A really good cup of coffee in the morning, finding a book that completely absorbs me, having conversations like this one where I feel like I'm really connecting with another person." She paused, looking down at their joined hands. "I've also learned that I'm happiest when I'm being completely myself with someone, not trying to be impressive or perfect or independent in ways that don't actually serve me." "You were always yourself with me," David said. "I was," Jessica agreed. "And that's part of why being with you felt so right. I never had to pretend to be anyone else or hide parts of my personality that might be too much for you to handle." David realized that the physical space between them on the couch had gradually decreased as they talked. They were sitting close enough now that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes, close enough that her perfume was creating a kind of pleasant haze in his thoughts. "Jessica," he said, his voice coming out rougher than he intended. "Yes? I need you to know that having you here tonight, learning all of this about why you left and how you've been thinking about us all these years, it's changing something in me. I can feel parts of myself waking up that have been asleep for a long time." Jessica's eyes never left his face. "Good things or scary things?" "Both," David said honestly. "Definitely both." She reached up with her free hand and touched his cheek gently. "I know, I feel it too. Like I'm remembering who I am when I'm with you, and also discovering who I've become since we were apart." The touch of her hand against his skin sent electricity through David's entire body. He found himself leaning into her touch, closing his eyes for a moment to focus on the sensation. When he opened his eyes again, Jessica was looking at him with an expression that was tender and vulnerable and full of hope. The dreamlike quality of the evening had transformed into something more intense, more immediate. This wasn't just about memory or nostalgia anymore. This was about two people discovering that their connection had not only survived years of separation, but had somehow grown stronger and deeper. "I don't want this evening to end," David said quietly. "It doesn't have to," Jessica replied, her voice soft but certain. "Not yet." The hours passed without either of them noticing. They had moved from sitting side by side to lying together on David's couch, Jessica's head resting on his shoulder while they continued talking in quiet voices. The rain had stopped sometime, around midnight, leaving behind a peaceful silence that made the world outside feel fresh and new. David could hardly believe how natural it felt to have Jessica in his arms again. Her presence had transformed his simple apartment into something magical, as if her being there had awakened possibilities he had forgotten existed. They had spent the time sharing stories about their lives over the past few years, filling in all the gaps that time and distance had created between them. "Tell me about the worst job you ever had," Jessica said, tracing lazy patterns on David's arm with her finger. David laughed softly. "There was this summer when I worked at a furniture warehouse. My boss was convinced that I was trying to steal boxes, so he would count them every morning and every evening. I spent 3 months being suspicious of cardboard." "That's terrible," Jessica giggled. "What about the best job?" "This one, actually, working at the bookstore. It's not glamorous, but I like being around books all day, and I like talking to people about stories. Sometimes customers come in looking for something specific, and I get to help them find exactly what they need." Jessica lifted her head to look at him. "That sounds perfect for you. You always loved recommending books to people. What about you? What's the most interesting work you've done?" "I spent 6 months working for a small nonprofit that helped elderly people write their life stories," Jessica said. "I would sit with people in their 80s and 90s, and they would tell me about their childhoods, their first loves, the mistakes they made, the things they were proud of. It was like being trusted with the most precious parts of people's lives." "That sounds amazing," David said, and he meant it. It was exactly the kind of work that would appeal to Jessica, combining her love of stories with her natural ability to make people feel comfortable sharing their deepest thoughts. "It was," Jessica agreed. "But it also made me realize how much time I was spending focused on other people's stories instead of living my own." As dawn began to filter through the windows, David became aware that this perfect evening was moving toward its natural end. The soft gray light made everything in the room look different, less magical and more ordinary. But somehow that felt right too. What he and Jessica had rediscovered together didn't need the cover of darkness or the dreamlike quality of an unexpected reunion. It was real enough to exist in daylight. "I should probably head back to my hotel soon," Jessica said quietly, though she made no move to get up. "I have a flight this afternoon." The words hit David like cold water. In all their talking and reconnecting, he had somehow managed to forget that Jessica was only visiting, that she had a life somewhere else that she would be returning to. "Where are you flying to?" "Chicago. I've been living there for the past 2 years. I have a job at a publishing house editing novels." David tried to keep his voice neutral. "That sounds like a great opportunity." Jessica sat up, turning to face him directly. "It is a good job, but David, that's not why I'm leaving. I'm leaving because I planned this trip before I knew how tonight would go. I didn't want to assume anything about what would happen between us." "And now?" David asked, not sure if he really wanted to know the answer. "Now I'm wondering if I'm about to make the same mistake I made years ago," Jessica said. "Running away from something good because it's easier than figuring out how to make it work." David sat up as well, taking her hands in his. "What would making it work look like?" "I don't know exactly," Jessica admitted. "Maybe it means me moving back here. Maybe it means you coming to Chicago. Maybe it means something else entirely that we haven't thought of yet." David felt his heart racing. The possibility of building a life with Jessica again felt both thrilling and terrifying. "Those are big changes." "They are," Jessica agreed. "But David, what we have together is rare. I spent years trying to find it with someone else, and I couldn't. Maybe that's because what we have isn't something you can just recreate with any person. Maybe it's something special that only exists between us." David knew she was right. The connection he felt with Jessica wasn't just about nostalgia or familiarity. It was about recognizing each other at a level that felt almost spiritual, understanding each other's thoughts and feelings in a way that made communication feel effortless. "I'm scared," David said honestly. "Last time we tried to make this work across distance, it fell apart. What if we try again, and the same thing happens?" "Then at least we'll know we gave it our best effort," Jessica said. "And David, we're not the same people we were then. I'm not running away from vulnerability anymore, and you're not trying to handle everything by yourself. Maybe that makes all the difference." David looked into Jessica's eyes and saw his own hopes and fears reflected back at him. She was right that they had both changed and grown over the years. The question was whether they had grown in ways that would make them better partners for each other, or whether they had grown in directions that would make them incompatible. "What if we start slow?" David suggested. "What if we don't try to figure out the big picture right away, but just see if we can stay connected and build something real between us?" Jessica smiled, and David could see relief in her expression. "That sounds perfect. No pressure, no expectations, just seeing where this goes." "I would like that," David said. "I would like that very much." Jessica leaned forward and kissed him softly, a kiss that felt like a promise and a beginning all at once. When they separated, David felt like the whole world had shifted slightly, like he was looking at the same life from a completely different angle. "I should really go get ready for my flight," Jessica said, though her voice suggested she was reluctant to leave. "I know," David said. "But Jessica, before you go, I want you to know that having you here tonight has been like waking up from a long sleep. You've reminded me of who I used to be, and also shown me who I might become." "You've done the same for me," Jessica replied. "For the first time in years, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." As Jessica gathered her things and prepared to leave, David felt a sense of calm certainty that he hadn't experienced in years. He didn't know exactly what would happen next, but he knew that whatever it would be better than the safe, predictable life he had been living. When Jessica reached the door, she turned back one more time. "David? Yes? This isn't goodbye. This is just the beginning of something new." After she left, David stood at his window, watching her walk down the street until she disappeared around the corner. His apartment felt different now, charged with possibility and hope. He looked around at his simple furniture and ordinary belongings, but everything seemed to hold more potential than it had the day before. For the first time in years, David felt truly excited about what tomorrow might bring.